So first of all, I think a lot has changed in terms of the way that company actually approach digital transformation. It's 5 years ago, it was a few companies were doing really well, others were questioning whether they should even sometimes do anything about these new technologies. I think today it's pretty much common parlance in company terms that everyone has launched some form of digital transformation program or some activity. I think the problem with the maturity is when we measure the maturity, we had some companies that were doing extremely well. We had quite a lot of companies doing nothing at all, and then some companies sort of dabbling at it. We classify them in beginners, conservative, fashionistas, and digital masters. And we did find some companies that were really truly ahead at that time. Companies like Nike, for instance, which were really making big headways in that area. I think today we could, we've just relooked at the data, tried to see whether movement has been made. And the problem with the maturity is that as much as there's been a lot of movement because most companies have actually carried out a digital transformation program, the difficulty has also increased. And it's increased because people have suddenly found first of all, that new technologies appeared on the scene. Everyone talks about AI today in broad terms. We have IoT in the operation. We have loads of these new, I would say, technological possibilities that have appeared, and all of them being actually quite complex. So if you take about IoT or AI or any of these, they are fairly advanced pieces of technology versus what we were looking at, like an e-commerce platform, for instance, a few years back. So the difficulty of creating value out of this technology has increased tremendously, and therefore you have, I think what we're seeing is a polarization of companies that are really, have mastered a number of digital transformation in the early days and are continuing to some extent adopt and experiment with this technology very effectively. And then companies that are still struggling with the basics. And the basics may not just be technological issues, they're very often organizational. And this is why we put so much emphasis on the how in the original book, because that we knew that the difficulties were also going to be a lot about people, competence and organization. So today what you see in the numbers is that actually progress has been made compared to our original data in the customer experience, which intuitively you can think with all the work that's been done on customer engagement, on customer data, on experience design, that's kind of a good outcome, I would say. And we found actually that a lot less progress has been made in operations, because operations is much more complex than it used to be. So if you take what we were looking at in 2014, things like streamlining processes through a piece of technology was difficult, but reasonably quick and doable in terms of business case. Today with an IoT application, if you're looking at doing predictive maintenance, for instance, you're talking about a mind-boggling application from the data capture to the data transport, the communication layer, and then the analytics. So extremely complex to put into place. And this is why I think we're seeing less progress in the operation on average. Okay, and then business model was a third pillar that we looked at. I still feel the same as I felt in 2014, that everybody talks a lot about disruption. We're having endless conversation about disruption until the moment you actually have to change your business model, because it's extremely hard. You have to deviate from the normal day-to-day work, because your existing business model is still producing your revenues and your profit. So it's how do you orchestrate, keeping an eye on making the today work, and at the same time building the business model of tomorrow. And very few companies are able to do that. So that's the first reason. And the second reason was there's all this talk about smaller startups taking over big companies and destroying entire sectors. Yeah, maybe, but I think what we're seeing is more, if you think about all the companies in fintech and in martech and all this, I think it's chunks of the business that are being attacked. But I think this opposition of startup versus big companies is the wrong way to look at the problem. In fact, most large companies that are successful have built a very effective ecosystem of partners, including startups, which they know how to use. So it's how do we get these companies to work together with large companies who have the resources to make effective application, rather than three guys and a dog in California taking over insurance. That's not kind of how it works. So I think if I go through the framework maybe, so I think the reason why people are doing digital transformation, the why, has become much more obvious. And I think it's even more compelling today. I mean, we showed that there was a profit motive to do this kind of program. It's absolutely true. We're, as I mentioned, we're seeing a polarization of the company that are really able to do digital transformation well, really racing ahead. So I think the why, the reason is more and more compelling. And I would say what's making it even more compelling today is that we mustn't forget that there are consumers and customers out there that also are changing their habits. So they are, totally aware of what your company product does. They can compare very easily. They can compare prices, and they're becoming very astute at getting the best deal they can online or wherever else. So the nature of, it's not just the companies that are changing; it's also the consumer is racing ahead. So I think the why you need to adopt this technology, for me, it has become quite obvious for most chief executives. But it doesn't mean they're doing it well. So if you look at the what, I think the what is really been driven by a multitude of new technologies that have appeared. So customer experience, you can see today with some of the companies that have mastered the data flows from their consumers, how much better they are at recommending next best action or at recommending a film for you or a book, or so it's getting very, very granular in the sense of they can understand you, and there's this real connection between customers and companies now, where I have to do a deal whether I'll give you, or if you give me a good outcome, then I'm quite okay to give you some data. I'm okay to give my bank my date of birth, my mother's middle name, or whatever it is they want to know, because there is a certain trust and secure relationship that you want to have with the bank. But if Google asks me the same thing, would I give that kind of data? No. Unless they can demonstrate really that they can give me something back. So Netflix, another good example. I'm quite happy for Netflix to feed off my viewing habits, because I know I will get better recommendation as we go forward. It has propped up all sorts of issues like privacy and how much data you share and so on and so forth. But my view is those issues will be solved as usual after the innovation has happened. So we will regulate after, which is the right way to do it in my book at least. And I think we're seeing a lot more advanced design being done. So people have understood now that it's not just about the architecture and the technology, it's also about the emotional design that you put into your experience. So that's why we've seen all sorts of designers actually becoming involved very, very tightly in the consumer experience. That's why a company like Capgemini have bought design companies because they're totally instrumental in how you design a world-class customer experience. So I think we'll see a lot more activity in the operation going forward around all this notion of automation, and let alone the whole field of artificial intelligence, particularly machine learning, which to me is we're really at the start of this. I mean, despite all the hype, I think we're still experimenting with a lot of this, but I can see really the potential of this technology to really formally change the operation and really change the business model that we have in operation, the operating model, the kind of the way we do operations. So if you look at a warehouse and completely automated, like you can see quite a few in some of the big retailers, the role of the human in the warehouse has changed radically. It's more to control that all the automated processes are working correctly, rather than stacking shelf and picking items. So we will see also quite a lot of changes through that to the work. And then there's another catchphrase like the future of work, which everybody talks about. But I think it's more about the way that we organize work and the way that we and the kind of skill set that we need from people to work in this completely automated environment. And I think the change we've seen, so that's the operation, and I think it's, as I say, it's going to be a huge revolution in the way that we actually run these companies in a much more automated way. And then on the business model side, I think what we've seen happening in the last 4 years is really this notion of the platform offering, and digital platform, whatever we call it, but really try to use platform economics, economies of scales and that kind of stuff to really deliver services. Again, everyone uses the same examples, Airbnb and Uber and all this kind of stuff. It's very hard for a large corporation to to do the same thing, but not impossible. So you really have to pick your areas where you can actually build platforms. Companies generally, I would say, have made some progress, but they're still struggling with the shift of the business model versus the old business they're doing. So that's kind of the changes we've seen in the what, mainly driven by, again, ample new opportunities to optimize or completely change your business or serve your customer better. And then there's the how. So in the how, I think the main change I see, so I will stick to my guns and say, the visioning up front is still as important as it used to be. So really envisioning is a very broad term, but by that I mean, sort of understanding why you're doing digital, what you're trying to achieve, how you devise strategies at the back of that is still as important as it used to be. Engagement, which was the second point that we raised in 2014, is still as important as it used to be. I think we have still some way to go in that area. I've seen some progress, but I also see some big failures, for instance, in collaborative tools, where people thought, if we deploy the technology, people will use it. And again, as usual, I keep repeating that, day after day, but, combining the understanding of how people can work better and training and explaining how you can use this tool much better is really the key to engaging the workforce. And then the last one we mentioned was this notion of a new deal to some extent between the technology side of the business and the business side. And we talked a lot in 2014 about marketing and IT in particular. I think this is still very valid. I'm a bit surprised at that because the data shows that actually hasn't improved very much. And yet you'd think, we are seeing a lot more cross-functional, multi-skilled team working together. We've had a whole wave of agile working, DevOps, you name it. I mean, we've made progress in understanding that the old model needs to change and we need more speed and yet I think what companies have got better at is getting from the ideation to the pilot or the MVP, but the scaling is still a huge issue. So we still need to work much more tightly between technology and the business to get this flow of technology really scaled into the business, because the scaling is where the business case really is. I would probably add one that we did put some emphasis in 2014, but I would really stick it right in the middle, saying we need to crack that, which is the whole notion of competencies and people. Because every single company I see today is still struggling in some way, form or shape about the lack of skills of their current employees, specific skills they can't get access to, like data scientists and digital marketers, cloud architects, you name it. So very specific skills that are needed to develop these things. And every company, big or small, are really struggling with that. So I think we need to. So if you think about that skill limitation, which everyone tells us, if there is one impediment to really accelerating our transformation, it is the skill and competency issues. And yet, I'm still seeing too few people and too few companies putting in programs for reskilling people, which are very complex programs, because you can take your population and increase their digital IQ generally, so they get what's going on. But then you also have very specific technical training. So you need to learn language Y, whereas you've been trained in language X. So that's a very specific type of training. And then they are training about how you work in new environment and new processes. So it's more, everybody talks loosely about reskilling, but there's various flavor of reskilling that you need to really understand to be able to effect this reskilling program. The changes that are going to impact jobs is going to be massive. Even if, and it's not about losing or keeping your job, even if you keep your job, the kind of nature of the work that you do will change quite radically, and I think we need to really pay attention to that. So I would add really this a fifth bubble in the middle that would be all around this notion of skilling and bringing the people up. So you have to crack the problem, and the second issue is that there is a scarcity of some of these skill sets. So you not only have to hire very scarce resources that are therefore very expensive, but also figure out ways that you can access them. And I think large companies are too much in a I need to own everything type of mindset. No, I mean, why don't you try to access? So, for instance, if you're looking for very advanced PhD data scientists and you're a chemical plant somewhere in the middle of nowhere, it's very unlikely that these guys are going to join you. Okay, they want to work for Google or Apple or where there is data. But you can get access to a lot of this skill set in managed services in other ways. So it's more about thinking, what do I need to make better decisions, and then get access to that. So that would be my new how would have a big proportion of this capability, skilling, and really trying to re-involve the entire HR community into this debate, because and it's happening slowly now, too slowly for my taste, that we need to reconnect HR with the business and not to count the number of holidays or anything like that, just to really take on the challenge, which is the biggest challenge of most corporations, is really move the entire skill set of the organization forward to be able to deliver those digital transformation programs. So I would look at really couple of things that have really sprung up. I'm getting more and more convinced, and we did some research again with the MIT demonstrated that the customer experience is becoming much more collaborative, much more involved between the firm, and so it's not that the firm and then there's the consumers, it's much more tactile, and it's physical. So you go to an airport, you print your own tickets, you print your own luggage, you take your bag onto the carriage. So you're doing a lot of the work that a company would normally do. And guess what? The paradox is I feel better for it, because I don't want to queue, I don't want somebody here to have to talk to someone. So that's and also the data side. So there's a physical side and a data side where, as I mentioned earlier, there's a deal as to I'm happy to give you something, but I need something in return. So unless I see this return, then consumer just draw blank. So I think the much more development of collaborative customer experience will really is showing up very, very clearly. For the operation side, it's all about the automations, and it's less clear. We know what's happening, we know the possibilities, but quite how we run operations in a completely automated format, and quite how we transform the workforce to actually be able to cope with that, is the jury is still out there, I would say, but I would definitely write about that. And then business model, I think it's more about leadership. It's more about how can we get people wired so they can at the same time do the work they have to do today to generate revenue and profit on the current model, but at the same time build and design the future. And it's a very hard thing to do for all sorts of organizational and reasons, but it's a leadership call that has to be made if we really want to crack the business model of the future for these companies, large companies that are making the transition.